Welcome to our COVID and collective trauma online conference today. I'm here with our first speaker, Thomas Hübl, and we're actually having some live interpretation from Anne here as well. So a big warm welcome to both of them. Before I introduce Thomas, I'm just going to go through some of the housekeeping for today. So we're going to have 3 lectures, and each talk is going to be approximately 2 hours long. We're going to have a 5-minute break, about 45 minutes into each talk, and we're going to have 20 minutes for Q&A at the end. If you've got any questions, please type them into the chat bar on the right-hand side of the screen, and we'll choose a selection of the best questions to ask each speaker at the end of their talks. So our second talk is going to be at 1 o'clock, and it's going to be on the science of building resilience from Dr. Joe Voss. And the final talk will start at 3:30 p.m., and it's going to be in post-traumatic growth from Dr. Suzanne Abadian. And the itinerary can also be found in the link in the chat bar on the right-hand side. So let's get started with our first talk on healing collective trauma from Thomas Hübl. So Thomas is a teacher, author, and international facilitator whose work integrates the core insights of the great wisdom traditions with the discoveries of modern science. Since the early 2000s, he's been facilitating large-scale events and courses that focus on the healing and integration of trauma, with a special focus on the shared history of Israelis and Germans. Over the past decade, he has facilitated dialogue with thousands of people around healing the collective traumas of racism, oppression, colonialism, and genocides in the US, Israel, Germany, Spain, and Argentina. He's the author of the new book, Healing Collective Trauma, a process for integrating our intergenerational and cultural wounds, which has been praised by some of the world's leading experts in the field, including Jack Kornfield, Peter Levine, Stephen Porges, and many others. His non-profit organization, the Pocket Project, works to support the healing of collective trauma throughout the world. You can learn more about his work at www.thomashübl.com. So let's give Thomas a warm welcome and let's get started.
Well, thank you, Niall, and welcome. Good morning, everybody. I hope my sound is good. If you can't hear me well, please type it into the chat box. And yes, today I want to explore with you the nature of collective trauma, since we are in a collective trauma situation globally. I think it's a very timely topic. And so when I grew up in Vienna, Austria. And when I grew up in a family where my grandparents were, of course, part of the Second World War. My parents were born short after the war ended, and I grew up in that family, and I saw especially my grandparents, and nobody at that time, of course, could tell me what I saw. I saw a little bit dissociated and melancholic and a little bit depressed quality of my grandfather. I heard stories from the Second World War from him. Some of them were very positive. Some of them were very painful to hear. And so as a boy, I grew up in that environment, and that environment shaped a part of my being, of course, as most probably it did for many of us too in other circumstances, with other biographies. And later on, in the early 2000s, when I ran groups, and my groups grew pretty quickly, and then I wasn't looking out for collective trauma. I did groups for human development and relational skill building and contemplative practices. And then something happened in my groups. And I tell you this story in order to give you a context to what I'm going to explore today with you. And then in my groups, when my groups reached a certain level of coherence, let's say 60, 80, 100 or more people at the beginning in those groups. And after 3 or 4 days, there was a kind of a collective eruption of 40 people at once started to cry. saw terrible images, internal images of the Second World War, the Holocaust. And it was like a fire in the group. And it was a very intense experience, and it took us 2 or 3 days to integrate the processes with the individuals of the group. And then the group ended. But from that time on, in almost every group, especially at the beginning, we did those groups in Germany or the German-speaking part of Europe, the same process happened, just with different people. And so after a few times, of course, I started to explore that deeper, and I got to understand a few principles of what I saw. And then I started to research that deeper and deeper and find commonalities and principles in the group processes. Then we did groups up to 1,000 people or more with Germany and Israel and the Holocaust past over the years. And then we started to take what we call the CTIP, the collective trauma integration process, which I also describe in my new book, Healing Collective Trauma. And then I took the principle cutout of the process and brought it to other parts of the world. And so what I've learned is, and I hear some background noise, maybe Niall, can we make sure that everybody is muted, maybe? Because I hear, somebody seems not to be muted, the participants. Okay, thank you. So, first of all, what is trauma? Let's define trauma. I know that there are many programs here also on trauma, and also beautiful programs on the polyvagal theory, which I highly appreciate as well. So, trauma means if somebody goes through a strongly overwhelming experience, so an experience that we cannot compute, that strongly overwhelms our computing power, physically, emotionally, mentally, we go into a very high hyper-stress reaction. Our nervous system is super stressed. At the same time, our nervous system has the power to fragment and split off or numb the part, and that part goes silent. I often compare that to, let's say you have a big TV screen on your wall, and you see a scene of a war scene of a movie. And then you take the remote control and you mute the image, like the movie, and the scene is still going on. And then you take the TV and you throw it into the ocean. And slowly, you see the TV screen dropping into the ocean, and you still see the scene going on. And then, at one point, the TV vanishes in the dark. So if that dark water is our collective unconscious, and if there are 6 million people or however many in concentration camps, the amount of overwhelming pain that happened for those people and people that experienced the war means there are millions of TVs still showing their scenes on the bottom of the ocean. But the important part is that the movies are still playing. And so I have been born by myself into the aftermath of the Second World War, and maybe many of us have been born into the aftermath of other bigger wounds and scars that we have left as humanity for the next generations to take care of. So I've been born, and nobody told me that certain things that I felt and saw as a boy were trauma symptoms. So I grew up saying, okay, this is how the world is. This is that people are reactive, that people's physical, emotional, and mental expression is fragmented, seems to be normal. So that the mind of a person can say A, but the emotions and the body of a person can say B at the same time, seem to be normal, because that was the environment that I grew up in. I saw that in my family. I saw this in my teachers. I saw that in society. I heard it from politicians. I saw it all over. So one of the true pandemics, I believe, is the inner split of the physical, emotional, mental experience of myself or another person that seems to be regular or normal. And that pandemic, since it's so widespread, creates something that is a societal norm. And there are no post-it stickers that say that expression is a trauma symptom. That expression is a trauma symptom. And I think that's pretty important, because if the physical, emotional, and mental experience is not coherent, we are constantly transmitting the tension of that inner fragmentation into our environment, and we experience our environment through the same inner fragmentation. And so when speaking of slides here, when we look at self-regulation, so if the mind, the emotions, and the body, and later on we will also do a practice together to make this more experiential. When the mind, the emotions, and the body are one coherent flow, so we call that inner coherence or inner flow. So that every thought process, in my understanding, is also a physical, emotional, mental expression. It's not just mental cognition. And especially in the parenting process, there's a simple example that I like to use that I think shows that very beautifully. So if, let's say, a child comes to the father or the mother and says, "Daddy, Daddy, I'm scared," then we have two different kinds of interventions. One is we tell to our child, "Oh, don't be scared. There is no danger here." The child is at home. The child got scared by a noise, and now the child runs to the parent. And the parent says, "Don't be scared. There is no danger. It's in our home." Or the other intervention would be that I pay attention to my child. I take a moment to feel, because my child is already scared. So I feel that you are scared. Come to me. I take my child on the lap and say, "Okay, let's have a look at what's happening." And in the first intervention, I created an emotional distance by telling my child not to feel what he or she feels. And I gave my child a rational answer to an emotional request. In the second option, I co-regulated the emotional request with my daughter, with my child. And then I brought in leadership, rational leadership, to say, "Okay, let's have a look." And I bring in parental orientation. So either I create distance. I even, on one level, wrong the emotional quality of my child by saying, don't be scared, which creates a distance. And then I give a rational answer. So the second version creates closeness, intimacy, belonging, co-regulation, grounding, and parental orientation, leadership. And the same is true not only for parenting, but the same is true also for our daily interactions in corporations. Either when team members or other people in the organization come with a need and feel stressed or activated, either we create a distance or we create closeness. And the reason why I'm saying that is because when we begin to explore collective trauma, we explore a dimension of life that all of us have been born into. It's no one ever was outside of collective trauma. And I think that's very important because I often compare it to, it's like you grow up in an apartment and you've never left your apartment. And suddenly a visitor comes to you and says, hey, by the way, how does the house look like that your apartment is in? And if I've never left my apartment, I cannot tell you, I can make assumptions how the house looks like based on my experience of my apartment, but I cannot really tell you how that house looks like because I have no subject-object transcendent perspective on to my house. So by all of us having been born into a collectively traumatized world, we can recognize the dimension of the individual traumatization of ourselves or another person that is based on the biography. I can understand if a client comes to me and says, listen, I had a car accident or I have XYZ attachment trauma. I can understand that, and I can also put that into a context of the person's biography. We can still, in a way, do the same thing for ancestral trauma transmission, so that my parents or my grandparents were traumatized, and that's why I go through the attachment process I go through. So my attachment trauma sits within a context of my ancestors' traumatization. But then there are the much larger wounds, like a world war or slavery and racism and structural violence in the US, or a Rwandan genocide, or many, many other dictatorships or large catastrophes that happened around the world, that are widespread wounds that affected an entire population of a country, a continent, and so on. I'm speaking of colonialism, for example. And so I believe as much as we are already advanced in recognizing individual trauma and also understanding the impact of adverse childhood experiences onto our health, our education, our participation in society and as citizens, and how we take responsibility as a citizen in our society. We know more and more about that dimension. But today I want to bring our attention to the more systemic aspect that is thousands and thousands of years old. It means that actually most of us, in a certain way, are looking through a broken window. And the cracks in our window affect information that goes outside and that goes inside, which means my expression and my perception. And as we see it here on this one slide, when we say there's presence, there's mind, emotions, body, and there's presence. So when we look at one fundamental quality of being a human being is the power to relate. And relation means that my body resonates with your body. My emotions resonate with your emotions. So if our nervous systems are attuned, and we create the synchronization of our nervous systems by feeling each other, which means the basic building block of relation is I feel you, and I feel how you feel me. I feel you feeling me. That's the basic building block of relation. And we all know how sensitive children are if their parents are aware of them, which is existentially important for a small child. And we are very much aware, consciously or unconsciously, if another person senses or feels us or not. And when I feel you, my body is in resonance with your body. But my body, I didn't invent my body. My body has been encoded in my DNA, and my DNA has grown over millions of years of life development. So being grounded in my body is not just a personal question. I would even argue or say that my body is not just as old as is written in my passport. My body is hundreds of thousands of years old for my cells to work together the way they work together, tissues, organs, a complex emotional system, the cognition. Many people thought many things that we think before us. So being grounded in that body is actually an ancestral question. And I believe that the trauma in our ancestral tree is deeply represented in our physical body today. And not only that, my capacity to feel you and to feel your body depends on it too. So my data flow that my physical body tells me moment to moment about your physical body is dependent on my nervous system being open, receptive, and in tune with your body. But the reason why I talk so much about that is because that often is in the background and our mental discourses are in the foreground. Same as with our emotional experience. The fact that we often have to ask each other what we feel and that we don't know what the other person feels is, I believe, a sign of collective trauma. Naturally, if my emotional system is open and resonant and vibrant, it's in tune with your emotional system and can pick up on your emotional internal world moment to moment to moment. same as my physical body does. And when we speak about trauma and collective trauma, I believe we need the entirety of our being, which is a physical, emotional, mental, spiritual expression. And that's what's represented here on the slide, that my mind understands your mind, but my mind is not here to interpret your emotions before I feel your emotions. So emotional intelligence is an emotional intelligence, not the cognitive understanding of emotions. And so I think that the basis of a fragmented world is in what I call the inner coherence of the flow of data in my nervous system, and then in relation or in a co-regulative relation with your nervous system. And that creates the basic building block of human relation. And if you want to take it a step deeper or smaller, the micro unit of relating is the fact that when you see me now on your screen, I don't see you, but if you see me now on your screen, the Thomas that you see is already in your brain. So I am in your brain. Same as if I were to see you now, you would happen in my brain. So human relation, two people that see each other, what they see is the perception in their central nervous system. And I want to take a moment it's a pity that the technology doesn't allow us to see each other now. But even without it, I think you see the two of us on your screen. And when you focus on us, what you feel is I am already in your nervous system. The perception of Thomas is already in your nervous system. And that's something we can become more and more aware of, because that means that the perception and our entire past that is still active are merging right now. And that process can be filled with much more awareness by sometimes slowing down and creating a higher resolution of that process of perception. Because if the window has cracks, then for sure the shade of those cracks affects how I appear in you and how you would appear in me. And I will return later to that micro unit of relating, because that, I believe, brings up many questions. For example, what is professional distance? Or how do we distance ourselves from events that are happening in our culture, or especially from traumatizing events that we read about on the news? So there's a constant traumatization going on in our cultural environment, and that constant traumatization is being fed to every one of us via news. And how we relate to those news feeds is interesting, given that once I hear about it and I see an image on BBC or CNN or any other kind of news feed, I am already carrying that image in my central nervous system. So pretty close, I would say, speaking in terms of intimacy. But I will return to that and come back to that later. For now, I want to develop a little bit more what I learned through all these groups about collective trauma. So we said there is individual traumatization that might be shock trauma or attachment trauma. Then there's ancestral trauma transmission. Then there are historic events like the Second World War. And then I believe there's the collective trauma of thousands of years as a systemic factor that affects humanity all the time. And then I need to develop the understanding of collective trauma a little bit more. I need one other element of understanding, and that's time. Because as I came to understand, seeing many, many people individually and groups, I believe there might be kind of a misleading understanding of the linearity of time. So yesterday is the past and tomorrow is the future. And I often say integrated history is presence. It's not the past. Integrated history sits here in us and allows us to have this moment together. And the entire complexity of what we are discussing today is part of the structures of consciousness that either speak right now or listen right now. So integrated history, in my understanding, is presence. And integration means the learning out of prior experiences added to the complexity of who we are. So every trauma that's being healed creates post-traumatic learning, because the integration always brings fragmented parts into integration and lifts them up into a higher synthesis. So there's always a learning that comes with trauma integration. So post-traumatic learning. But if the past, which is unintegrated information, stays frozen, then that's the past that we often refer to when we deal with our lives today. So unintegrated history is the past. Integrated history is the complexity that we are living through right now. It's presence. But that's very important, because that unintegrated history has a tendency to repeat itself. We all know that trauma has a tendency, almost a repetition compulsion, to repeat itself. So unconscious traumatization has repetitive consequences in my life. So where I'm not integrated, I might have recurrent relationship arguments with my wife, conversations that I don't have once, or maybe even twice, but that I have ongoingly. And if I have them ongoingly, they are not emergent, they are not specific to that situation, they're a pattern. So unintegrated past repeats itself in what we call the future, tomorrow. Tomorrow I have a similar conversation that I already had. That's not the future. That's the repetition of the past. Otherwise, it's a bit confusing, because otherwise we call tomorrow the future, when often tomorrow is a repetition of yesterday. And I think that's pretty important when we do trauma integration work, to correct a bit our understanding of time. That innovation and creativity comes from the future. But a later point in time is not necessarily the future. It might as well be a repetition of the past. With other words, to make it more illustrative, it means that I take the highway that I drove already on, the last 10 kilometers, I put it in front of myself and I drive it again, and I call it future. But that's not the future. That's the highway that I know already. And I'm bound to drive on. And I believe that also highlights why tending to our past, or when the saying that time will heal all the wounds, that's not really true, because if we don't pay attention and find ways to integrate traumatization, we are often bound to repeat that. We are going through recurrent experiences that will either strengthen the trauma or repeat it. But if we integrate traumatization, individual and collective trauma, we actually participate in a systemic learning process. So we always learn something important. That's why we can, for example, turn away from the fact that many European countries were part of a massive atrocities through colonialization. We can turn away from the fact that the Holocaust happened, but actually only by finding the courage to turn towards it, we will stop. After some time, at least, we will reduce the fragmentation of our world, and we will upgrade the collective learning process. And since we have been born into that world, first of all, it needs an awareness process, because it needs us to examine carefully which structures in our society are real structures of our society, and what kind of structures in our society are ice, which means frozen life. And that's pretty important, because if I go back for one moment, when we look at an individual or a systemic evolution, development, or changeability, like the capacity to change. For example, right now, I believe we are facing two major, maybe multiple, but let's reduce it to two. We are facing two major crises. We are in a global pandemic that forces us as a society to collaborate. But that collaboration seems, at least for a certain extent, challenged, given the fragmentation that we see in multiple parts around the world, how to deal with the challenges as a society. The other challenge that we are facing that has just been pushed to the background in our news is that climate change is putting a rising pressure onto many societal systems. So the pandemic is adding a lot of stress, but climate change is increasing the stress. And as we all know, over the next decade, that stress is just going to grow. So if a situation is going to meet me as a person, or meet us as a society, in the place that anyway wants to develop and grow, so that's what I called here the evolutionary power. Every one of us has a creative force inside that anyway wants to develop and wants to participate and wants to be part of a creative process. That intelligence creates habits or structures. And those structures are either fluid structures that we can build those structures either in ourselves, in our neuroplasticity. So if I get to know a new person and I start wiring that person as somebody that I know, and it becomes a fluid structure, or I create a business, I create a company, And the company has a structure that's needed in order to give it a home in our world, but is adaptable, so I can rearrange that structure if evolution needs it. Or if my life changes, then it's needed. And if climate change hits our business or economy world, then certain structures have to change in order for updated structures to come on the scene or on the stage of life. But often, systemically, it's hard for us to discern what are real structures of our society and what are frozen structures that are based on trauma. Because every one of us carries, or many of us carry, a certain element of traumatization, and that's a society building factor. So my trauma and your trauma, they create systems together. So we are creating systems together based on the traumatization and the compensations that we need to overcome the lack of responsiveness. And I think that's an interesting question for all of us. And we will, after the break that we will take in a minute, we can reflect a bit more in a kind of a guided inner journey on all what I said. Because trauma is not only anymore a personal biographical event and experience and impact. The trauma response in me and the trauma response in millions of people in our society create societal agreements and structures like language, like value systems, like frozen structures that are not adaptable, that we need in order to keep the trauma at the bottom of the ocean, which means because what we usually see is not the trauma, what we usually see are just the symptoms of the trauma. As everybody knows that works with traumatized clients, what we hear about is the symptom. The trauma is sitting in a deeper place, much more hidden. And only when we find that deeper place together through appropriate relation and presencing and competence, we can slowly let it integrate and unfold appropriately so that the symptoms will cease and more flourishing can happen, post-traumatic learning. So when I saw in my groups the massive eruptions of what I call today collective trauma material, it became clearer and clearer to me that the pressure that I saw unleash in the groups lives in us 24/7. The still playing movies of millions and millions of TVs at the bottom of the ocean have a serious co-creative effect onto the way we create societies. And I think we see that now that COVID creates more pressure on our systems, and the fragmentation and the way we collaborate is deeply challenged at the moment. We saw it in the election in the US. We saw it, we see it in many parts in Europe, how the underlying fragmentation comes up as othering, as racism, as againstness against the government or leadership structures, and. So, and maybe the last image before we take a break, just for contemplation. The first time I took a group of many years ago, when I took my first group into the Himalayan mountains for a meditation retreat as part of our 3-year training program, I sat on the plane and I looked down. I came into Kathmandu at night, and I looked down onto the city, and we all know how cities look like at night from the plane perspective. You see all these veins of light, and it was kind of very, very early in the morning. And then I saw that dark spot. And then maybe you know that in Kathmandu, they have to close down quarters, like they have to shut down the electricity to save money. So there are always 3-4 hours, certain quarters have no light. And sitting on the plane, I looked at this dark spot and I said, wow, it's very interesting. I cannot tell you from the plane perspective, I cannot tell you what's happening in that part of that area. That might be a part of the city. It might also be a lake. It might also be a forest or a mountain. And then I thought, wow, that's a genius explanation for the human unconscious. That the numb and the fragmented parts within our nervous system and the dissociated parts of our nervous system, there are areas that, on the plane perspective, the sense of self has no access to, but there are processes happening that we are not aware of. And that's true for our individual experience, but it's also true for our collective experience, because where I am unconscious, I will make unconscious agreements with you, and we will perpetuate the past together. So we are all shadow investors in the collective shadow corporation of humanity. Because there is no individual shadow only. There is no individual unconscious only. That individual unconscious can only persist within an environment that is conducive. So it's always kind of an interdependent, shared aspect of our existence as human beings. And so I want us to have a short break and then come back. And in the second part, we will also have some guided journey that we have a more practical application, and then maybe a little bit of a theoretical continuation and some Q&A section at the end. Okay, so let's continue. So we summarized the first part. We talked about, I think, the basic knowledge of trauma many are aware of, that trauma is being treated, and it's also very important as an individual process. At the same time, we want to expand the lens and the perspective that trauma is always like an interdependent system. Same as every individual is a specific expression of the whole. It's not a separate particle. Like the air in our lungs shows us that no one is separate. So we're all part of a living system. And so an individuation is a specific expression of the whole. And that puts us also much more in touch again that the ancestry that we are part of is very important as our deep grounding that we bring the gifts of our current life into. And then we talked about the systemic factor of traumatization, that we can more and more unveil the dimension of structures in our societies that are actually based on trauma. And since we are heading in a time where, first of all, technology, as we are using it right now, makes the world every day a little bit smaller because we are becoming a global village. Also the rise of the world population, of course. But we are slowly, there were times when we put the toxic waste outside somewhere. But now outside is inside. And we are seeing the painful effects of that, how many toxins are returning through the food chain into our bodies. The microplastic is returning to our bodies, but also that whatever we excluded in the past wants to be, there's a rising pressure for it to be included in order to get the learning that is still frozen in the trauma of the past. And so there are, in the book, I describe like a pendulum movement between the scientific research on trauma and what science says today about trauma and collective trauma. But I put that into a dialogue with the mystical science, the science of our wisdom traditions. And then I describe in depth the CTIP, that process designer I spoke of earlier, how to integrate collective trauma with the larger groups of people, building on high-level relational competencies, coherence building methods between individuals and groups. We are working a lot with the fact that the individual is a specific expression of the whole, so that every individual going through an integration process benefits the whole, and the whole is the resonance body that embraces the individual. So there is a very powerful healing component in the strong presencing of larger groups. And I believe that's a factor that is speeding up like the integration process, if it's being done appropriately and carefully. And then when we grow up in family systems, we talk about like our internal conditioning. But there is also another conditioning that I spoke about, is me growing up in Austria. The post-war atmosphere in Austria in the decades following the Second World War, of course, had a forming factor, a conditioning factor onto my awareness and consciousness and inner psychology. And I'm curious, since we come from different places around the world, how you experience that. And I would love to take you, so that we don't have only kind of a theoretical exploration, but we put that a little bit into practice. I would love to take you onto some kind of inner journey or exploratory process where we look first at the coherence of your own physical, emotional, mental, inner state. And then to reflect a little bit on your own upbringing. How did collective trauma that is being introduced to us by life as a regular part of life, how did that impact your own experience of the world? And I think just by asking that question, we are already opening a space where more information can come into our awareness. And so let's do that for maybe 10-15 minutes, go through that internal exploration, and then I'll continue from there. So maybe we start with taking a breath, and like one beautiful thing about our breath is wired in our nervous system from day one on, ongoingly. And so when I connect via my breath to my body, for example, by slowing down my exhalation a bit and prolonging my exhalation, and every time I exhale, I use my exhalation to guide me deeper into my body awareness. And then just to connect to the first impressions that you get, just connecting to your body posture, the movement of your breath, but also like more subtle sensations. Especially, where is your body the most alive? Where do you feel aliveness, vitality, pulsing, streaming? Just by putting your attention onto the live parts, like your awareness of the subtlety that composes the body grows. There are even more sensations that were hidden at first. Aware that what you connect to and feel is a lot of information streaming through your nervous system. There's a lot of data streaming up and down the spine. Maybe there are patterns like tension patterns or stress patterns in the body that are also present when you tune in with yourself. Or maybe certain parts of the body that are less accessible, they're more absent. The physical state, and you include the emotional state. What's your emotional state right now? Is there an awareness of an emotional flavor, or does it feel more kind of disconnected at the moment emotionally? And again, whatever you find, that's exactly what we find. There's no need to change that. And the same with your mental experience. When you pay attention for a moment to your mental experience, is the mind very busy, calm? But also, does the mind feel stressed and tense, or open and inspired and creative? So you're aware of feeling your body, your emotions, your mind. And what's aware? What's the awareness itself? Which part of you is aware that you feel yourself? Just in your current experience. And then from the deeper state of presence and attunement, you just take a moment and reflect on if trauma is a systemic process and all the individual traumatization has a culturally creative effect. So we are co-creating culture through our open streaming intelligence, our capacity to build healthy structures, internal and external structures. But then we also co-create a society based on our trauma. And if you look at the society around you and wherever you live in the world, what are the collective trauma, the systemic trauma effects? Just when you take a few moments to reflect on what in the culture I live in might be either collective trauma structures or collective trauma symptoms. Trauma in our language. Has trauma been encoded through language patterns? sector in our healthcare system. How do we see the systemic aspect of trauma in the education system? Now, economy world, how does it affect big tech, our use of technology and social media, and the big tech impact? Our media landscape and political system. So if we were to throw some magic dust into the architecture of our societies, and the magic dust would reveal all the structures and processes that are based on trauma and trauma symptoms, what would that magic dust reveal for us? And then before we finish this kind of reflection, if you look now, coming back to yourself, letting the big systems go for a moment and just see what, if I ask the questions that I ask, is there anything inspiring or any kind of thought process or creative process being kicked off that you would like to explore more for yourself? the impact of trauma and collective trauma onto our societies and systems, and how we live in those systems. Well, great. And then let's take a couple of deeper breaths and come back. So I have a few more reflections, and then maybe we can enter like a Q&A phase. I see that there are many questions already in the chat. If there are any thoughts that you are coming out of this exploration with, like anything that came to your mind or awareness when I asked the questions, maybe one or two sentences. If you don't mind to put that in the chat so that we can read a bit what comes up when I ask the questions about how collective trauma creates systemic structures. If you, whatever, one or two sentences, just by going through that reflection, maybe you can type anything that's in you right now into the chat so we can collect that. Hmm. Maybe everyone can read just a few so that we are connected, since we can see each other here, but we can connect to each other also through the comments and collective creativity or experience. And keep on writing that. I hope, Niall, we can collect the chat. I don't know if sometimes it's great when these things can be read afterwards. I would certainly love to read the chat later. And while you are writing, two things I think that are still important. One is, as I said, by growing up within a collectively traumatized culture, I believe it needs an awareness process how that collective traumatization impacted my own development. Because if I've been conditioned by the collective trauma structure of my society, it might be harder for me to see and feel and become aware of the entirety of its impact, because my perception has been shaped by the very field or by the very environment that I want to become aware of. And I like to say that when we got the first photo from outer space of the planet, the overview effect, we could see this beautiful planet Earth. But there were two things that photo doesn't show. One is that the astronaut that took it also was part of the collective trauma field and not outside of it. So even if the photo has been taken from outer space, the person that took it carried to some extent some trauma in the nervous system and the epigenetics and so on. And the other aspect that we don't see is how many scars the planet has. I mean, we see it more and more now through the devastation that our biosphere goes through. We actually see the physical manifestation of those scars. But all the major human atrocities and also maybe natural catastrophes that caused a lot of systemic trauma doesn't show up on that photo. And I think that's very important, that we all have been more or less been born into like a scar tissue or a wounded tissue. And we are also potentially part of the healing of that tissue of life. So in our societies are also like a fabric, there's a tissue, and our experience in that society, we can become kind of a healing impulse within that tissue. So I think that's very hopeful, and that we also create more healing communities and not just isolated healing environments, but communities of healing. I believe that's where we are heading to in the future, that also our capacity to have collective healing spaces is growing. And I think we are at the beginning of such a journey and a new expansion, especially also through technology. And I think we are learning more and more about that dimension at the moment. And for us to see that the collective trauma conditioning is a field in itself, more and more the collaboration with the transmission of ancestral trauma onto us and the effects in our lives and how we do ancestral trauma healing, the collective trauma healing, because in many of my groups, I saw what I call the entanglement of the individual traumatization within a collectively traumatized environment. So how that showed up is that the healing process of a person would continue to a certain degree. And then it was very obvious that without including the collective atmosphere that was part of traumatizing moments, the integration process would stall. So when there were cities that have been bombed in the Second World War, and many people got traumatized at the same time, it's a different environment than when the society is pretty stable and one person is being traumatized. So there's a different dynamic. And I believe in the integration process, we have to be aware of the difference between the individual experience within the collective environment, the atmosphere or the ecosystem of that social environment has an impact on the resourcing, the stabilization, and the integration process. So I find it fascinating how we include in individual healing processes the collective atmosphere that has been wired in the nervous system at that moment. And so the individual and the collective again are interdependent, are an interdependent whole. It's a whole system. And one of the systemic factors that, or one of the systemic symptoms that trauma and collective trauma create is a sense of isolation. It's a sense of separation. It's a sense of withdrawal or freezing. So that we see that the degree of separation and the worldview based on separation are trauma symptoms. And it's very important for every one of us to look how much is my experience of the world, moment to moment to moment, based on that underlying assumption that there is anybody who could be separate, or that separation is a very deep inner experience, but it's not a reality that is that we perpetuate and think our systems through. And I think that's very important, how we create systemic containers that are bigger than the experience of separation that we might carry within ourselves. And so I want to summarize and then transition to I see the time progresses so that we have some time for the questions that you asked. So we talked about the nature of individual traumatization, the interdependence of the individual and the collective as one system, which means also interdependent health is that every individual comes with the systemic aspect that the individual lives in. I cannot just be hypnotized by the individual. I need to be able to think the individual as an interdependent whole with the ecosystem that the individual lives in, and not be part of an isolated experience, but an interdependent experience. And then we talked about the larger systemic aspects of traumatization and how trauma becomes a society creating, like parts of our societies are being based or created on, or created out of ice, which means frozen structures. And when we look at climate activism, we can see that activism, so we talked about the three forces, evolution, habits, and trauma. When activism is a tremendously important intervention, when it's about education, when it's about activation energy, when we need to change old habits and create new structures in our society. So for that part of societal change processes, as we need it at the moment to meet the climate change necessities, is great. But if activism puts a pressure onto frozen societal structures that are based on trauma, it will create a lot of backlash. And that backlash has been created through an unskillful intervention, because that kind of intervention will not be able to deal with the frozen structures that are based on ice. They are based on wounds. They are based on a sense of not being safe. That needs a whole different, an entirely different intervention in order to allow more healing, more safety, less othering, less fragmentation, and to harvest the energy that is frozen in that kind of permafrost, like the trauma permafrost, to bring that intelligence slowly back into kind of a creative flow. So what on the one hand is a great change accelerator in our society, on the other hand is activating the sand in the engine of cultural change processes, because at that level of societal stagnation, we cannot act with pressure. And even if it seems urgent, the urgency of change needs to change our habits, but cannot change in the same way collective trauma structures. And that's why I believe when these three forces, like the part of me that anyway wants to develop, the part of me that has internal and external structures that are changeable, and the part of me that is hurt, if we create a different discernment and we have a different awareness of these three forces, I think we will also be, paradoxically, sometimes by slowing down, we will be much more effective as communities and societies to change according to the evolutionary needs. Yeah, so that's a little bit of an overview. Many of these things I wrote down in Healing Collective Trauma, the new book that came out. For anybody that is interested, I've seen it has been posted already here in the chat before. And I think given the time, there are so many comments and questions. Maybe Niall, can we transition already now to some of the interesting questions, so it's at least a little bit more like a dialogue for us here? Is that possible?
Hello, Thomas.
Yes, I hear you.
Yeah, so thanks very much for a fantastic presentation. We've had a lot of engagement and a lot of questions, so great job. First one here is from Graham. Now, Graham has asked, how do I reconcile the dichotomy of fearing you feeling me relationally, as historically it had led to violation and loss?
Yeah. So you said fearing me relationally, yes, not feeling me. Yeah, okay, now I understand. Yeah, I think that at the base of a lot of trauma healing is our capacity to build appropriate relations. So that's first, like our skill, our relational skill or the competence to be in a way attuned to such a high level that we can create what I said at the beginning, that our physical, emotional, and mental experience can create a resonance field with another person's physical, emotional, and mental experience. Okay. But through our individuation, we either learn that the content of our development happens in relation, in appropriate relation, especially to our parents or our teachers, or we learn to withdraw our internal content and hyper-manage or hyper-regulate our inner world. And since that has been, at least for some of it, the experience of many of us, we can see moment to moment how every one of us at certain moments, what we call, feels more open and connected. In other moments, the internal process is so strong and we pull out of our relational experience. So we feel more separate or isolated or withdrawn. And in order to reverse that, when it's done through like skillful relating, we create a resonance with exactly the way the process is. Because the internal defense mechanism is built on everyone's intelligence. So my internal defense mechanisms are built on my intelligence. I build them. And so whenever I needed it, I needed that more than anything else. Because the coherence maybe of my family system couldn't provide me like a different path, with a different path. So that's what I could do. Every child will try to create the highest coherence inside that's possible in the given environment, as long as it can. and if the fragmentation is not too strong. And so when there is fear coming up, fear has a physical dimension. There's a physical process in our body, and it has an emotional dimension, and then it usually has a mental interpretation system put on top of it. And I believe the capacity of us allowing fear slowly to re-enter relation in an appropriate pace is part of the healing. But then we might think, for example, if for many people is when I say I don't trust you because what I'm saying is I'm afraid of you. But if I say I don't trust you, then the remedy is not to trust. The remedy is to not trust consciously in order to honor the internal process in relation, and then maybe slowly replace that process by something that's more functional right now. But that's very important, that the fear will be respected and not seen as an obstacle. Because for many of us, and especially in our society, the high amount of fear that is in our systems is often compensated so strongly that we developed so many mechanisms to compensate on that level of fear that many of us share. And so we have systems that are way too fast, because slowing down would mean to ground ourselves and become often very afraid. Because slowing down means that we meet more what is, or we turn our internal experience and nervous system into a state of digestion. But often what was most painful in the past is what we are running away from. So we become faster, and many of us would like to be more developed than we actually are. So we want to be ahead of ourselves, and that's a big fear symptom in our societies. Same as our economy system is often based on fear, and that's why it's eating more of the physical substance of the planet. Same as if my lifestyle is not sustainable, which means that my level of activity can be sustained in a good way by my body, which means that I'm not eating the substance of my body by the way I'm living. So I'm in a regenerative flow of my creative output and my own regeneration and recuperation. That's the most intimate version of climate change or climate sustainability, is the way I live. Because if I don't live sustainably in my body, and that's the closest part of nature to my experience, then I can't be part of a sustainable society. So if in relation, fear comes up and we learn in a mutually supportive relation to allow that fear more and more to be part of relation again, then two computer processors start to process and co-regulate something that couldn't be co-regulated in the past. And that's the same with the example that I said. Either I say to my child, don't be scared, which devalues the fear and overrides it with a rational argument. Or I say, I can feel that you are scared, creates emotional coherence. We co-regulate the fear and the stress, and then we bring in, okay, let's have a look what's really happening. And we bring in leadership and orientation. And I think many of us were missing that kind of process in one way or the other. So the fear stayed in the system if the child chronically doesn't get that. So, or if there are worse traumatizing events. So we are staying with a whole load of fear that's being put into the storage of our nervous system and that walks with us every day. So I think the relational dynamic and the relational healing are really important, and that relation is a very specific process as well as it is a universal process. I think that's very important. When trauma is stored at the age of 5, let's say, in a person, it needs a very specific relation that includes the, let's say, 40-year-old person that comes to my office, plus it's specifically connecting to what has been heard at the level of 5. And only when that's being restored through the missing piece, the whole system can go into an integration process and integrate that level of development. If not, then we just, because I read another comment before in the chat, that's true. If we just activate trauma through the biography and by, connecting to the trauma without the appropriate relation that can meet it on the level where it happened, it's just a re-traumatizing process. It's because there's no way out. We just activate the trauma without offering the right environment for it to integrate. That's very important. So just thinking and going into the trauma without the appropriate relation, and the appropriate relation is not that I'm talking to a 40-year-old person in my office. That's not enough. That it needs my own nervous system to model the environment that wasn't available to that person at the level of 5. My nervous system needs to be able to model that environment. If not, then I will trigger the trauma without offering the right environment, so it cannot integrate itself. And I think that's a very important process. So I agree with some of the comments that have been made, that only when the right environment can be substituted or provided, two nervous systems can go into a mutual healing process, especially when it's developmental trauma, that meets the organism exactly where it got frozen. And if it's not specific enough, that's not going to happen easily. So we will become more aware of the trauma area, but it's not going to integrate. So the person will keep on expressing the symptoms in his or her life.
Cool. That's a fantastic answer, Thomas. Thank you very much. The next one is from Kelly, and Kelly has asked, how can we encourage a collective healing response in a culture that values individualism?
Yeah, I think it's true. We need to, I think the collective development is inevitably by growing into a global village. We are inevitably forced by evolution, so to speak, to really look at some of our identity structures and at some of the ways how we view ourselves and the world. So some of the hyper-individualistic hypnosis that at least some parts of the world are in will have to open up to a healthy understanding of the interdependence. And I say it again, like a specific expression of the whole. That every individual is always part of the living system, but expresses a very specific quality in an individualized way. And that interdependent whole, I believe, is part of us growing, like the recognition of that the ecosystem that I'm part of, the relational ecosystem that I'm part of, is inherently interwoven with my health, for example. So there's interdependent medicine. And my mental and physical health depends on the water that I'm swimming in. So if I'm swimming all the time in toxic water, it will affect my health. So I cannot be thought and I cannot live alone just without anything else. That doesn't work. I'm part of a web of life. And I believe that the current state of our world and also the current global issues that we are facing are an evolutionary pressure to another level of global collaboration. But on the way there, we are facing a dilemma, which is what I said before, that evolution, every one of us wants to develop anyway in the part where our intelligence is open. We call it purpose development, or finding our path in life. And how we create habits that are changeable, like in our neuroplasticity, but also in society, how we create organizations, structures, societies, we can deconstruct and reconstruct those. But with the trauma structures, it's way more sensitive. And I think there are more and more people, like also professional people, but also collective trauma-informed competence building. They are highly trained professionals. That's for complex issues that need to be taken care of by therapists and highly trained people. But then there is also a collective competence building, and these two need to work together. And if we manage to develop both collective trauma-informed competence and high-level individual expertise, we can distribute the needs accordingly. So the highly trained professionals will not be overwhelmed, because other parts of society can take care of certain needs that don't need to land in the office of. And so if that hierarchy of the question, as I call it often, where do I go with my question or need, if that's better distributed in society, I think it also creates a more healthy equilibrium. And so we are on the way to, I think, to the necessity is also to create more collective healing environments and collective, like, trauma-informed communities. As a friend of mine, Christina Bettel, who also works as a professor at the Johns Hopkins University, and she is one of the leading voices of the ACEs studies, and she spoke also in front of Congress 2 years ago, like with all her studies and research about the level of traumatization in the US, and it's interesting because she also speaks about like the trauma is a syndemic. It's like there are around 66% of the US population carries a trauma of some sort, and the rest of the population, like children that go to school with other children that are traumatized, are also exposed to trauma symptoms and trauma. So basically the entire population is exposed to some degree. And so we are having this systemic effect that we have to take care of together. And why I mention her is because she is also working a lot on trauma-informed community building and how healing communities can be formed so that we have the right environment that is not caught up in that hyper-individualistic or separate worldview. Yeah. So interdependence, I think, is a good word for that.
It's very interesting. So our next question is from Rebecca. How does a belief in a greater power, like God or spirit or something like that, affect the level of trauma felt by a collective? And just on top of that, would a secular culture be more vulnerable to collective trauma and less resilient in the face of it than a spiritual culture, for example?
Right. I think with this, yes and no. A friend of mine who is also a professor here at the Tel Aviv University. She is a psychology professor that researches collective trauma here in Israel, and her studies show that basically two factors that create community resilience are, of course, community building and relational competence, as we talked about it before, and the other one is faith. But I think we have to be very specific about faith. So, because in my understanding, a deeper contemplative and meditative practice can be an enormous, and there is a way to call that mindfulness, but I believe it goes beyond mindfulness. Even if we study a bit deeper the core of the wisdom traditions, it's not just mindfulness. That's, I believe, in secular cultures, sometimes a welcomed reduction of spiritual practice. And if we go deeper into the dimension of spirituality, we can see two effects that are important to know about. One is that the spiritual dimension and the contemplative dimension can be an amazing resource, and if it's used skillfully and also with competence, which means that we know what kind of spiritual practices actually train which part of a human being or our experience. So then it becomes a tremendous resource building tool. And it also connects us to a much deeper meaning, and it also connects trauma healing. The trauma healing always at the base has, or most of the time at the base, has like an ethical correction as a consequence. Because if inappropriate relation was hurtful and harmful, the trauma, the healing of PTSD or of complex PTSD and complex trauma can lead to an ethical reconciliation or restoration of victim-perpetrator dynamics, of all kinds of inappropriate relations, into a higher understanding of ethics. And I believe that's very important. That trauma healing is not just taking care of PTSD, it's in the depth a restoration of the fabric of life, of the self-healing mechanism of life, because it's built into my body. If I cut myself, my body tries to heal it if it's possible. And I believe the ultimate healing of trauma is always an ethical correction. It's an ethical growth. Or restoration between two people, but also between nations, or between colonizing nations and colonized nations. And so I think that's important. On the other hand, I often see how many people want to use the spiritual dimension as a bypass, not to deal with the trauma, and then it becomes another kind of stagnation. So if spirituality becomes an exit door to seek for some kind of higher truth, without being embodied and being able to live in this world with all its challenges and all its difficulties that it comes with, and also with all its beauties, then the spiritual path becomes actually an exit door into stagnation. And I think if we are mindful of these two, then we can harvest literally the enormous resourcing that's possible, and the mindfulness and the presencing to be more embodied and to be able to meet our trauma history better. And I think Otto Schama puts this also beautifully in his work. When Otto talks a lot about, so what I call collective trauma, I think Otto calls collective absencing, and that a lot of social pathologies happen in the collectively absent parts. When I said before that in my own nervous system, the traumatized areas become more numb, and the anesthesia of my own trauma makes me be absent in parts of my own life. And the collective anesthesia also has severe side effects in the way how we deal with collective issues, and how it creates a collective indifference to step up and take ownership and responsibility as citizens. And also we see in the tremendous amount of projections that are going on in our societies in relation to politics and leadership. So I think that there is a lot that we can look at, but I think that exceeds a bit our session for today.
Okay. Just a couple more questions now, Thomas, before we finish up. If you were brought into a meeting with some of the world leaders, like people that are making decisions that are influencing society as a whole, and you were giving them advice on how we can best heal from the collective trauma from COVID-19, for example, what practical things would you advise them to do on how we can best move forward as societies and as a culture? And the second thing is, for anybody that's listening to this, maybe someone that's a psychotherapist or someone that is interested in developing knowledge and skills in this area and would like to work in the field of healing collective trauma, what are some next things they can do? Like what would you recommend that they do from this point on?
Yeah, these are big questions for 1 minute. But I love to say one thing, like snowflakes falling into a river, into the water, become water. Snowflakes falling on iced over rivers become snow that piles up. That means COVID onto a societal framework that can be healthily related to a global challenge can deal with that global challenge. But like snowflakes, a COVID falling on iced over rivers, which means pre-existing collective traumatization of the culture, will create follow-up traumatizations that will be hard to be met. It will be hard for the society to meet those challenges. And that means that as for us as leaders to understand the degree of societal transformation and the degree of societal traumatization, and then to be able to put them together and see, okay, these are the aspects of society that I can address with XYZ tools, but that's the part of society that needs a different addressing, that needs a different safety and security. If I don't take care of the tremendous amount of existential fear and threat in the society, every follow-up crisis will create a lot of societal symptoms and fragmentations that I will call political challenges. But on a much deeper level, we are just meeting the fragmentation that existed prior to COVID. And so there is the part that the resilient part of me that can meet and stay related to challenges. And then there is the part where when a challenge comes, my own trauma gets reactivated. And then I call it overwhelming, difficult problem, massive challenge, and so on. And I think if we can have just a higher sensitivity, that would be number one, to see, okay, certain interventions are great for societal transformation or leadership on this side. And then I need a different intervention when I meet the traumatization. And that's not easy. I'm not saying it's easy because the system is so complex, but it needs that awareness. And I think if we have that awareness, then we can allocate resources to take care of what we can do in the open parts of our societies and what we have to do with the pre-traumatized part. Otherwise, this will always come up as massive sand in the engine to work together as a society to meet a global challenge. And for the collective trauma, I think it's a young field. It's emerging, and everybody who is interested, I mean, in the book, I'm also referencing other authors, and we are also running a non-profit organization, which is called the Pocket Project. And we have 23 international labs that deal with all kinds of collective trauma fields around the world. And so if anybody is interested, it's called the pocketproject.org. And we do a lot of collective restoration work, colonialism and racism in the US and the Holocaust and Africa and Latin America, Asia. So there is a lot, and also other like gender violence and other collective trauma fields. So anybody who is interested interested, it's called thepocketproject.org.
Okay. Well,
Yes.
Thomas, thank you very much. That was absolutely fascinating. It's been brilliant to have you on board for the event. So I wish you the best of luck with all the work that you're doing. And yeah, everybody else will be back at 1:00 for our second presentation from Dr. Joel Voss on the science of building resilience. So thanks again, Thomas. Thanks to Anne and Liz for interpreting. Really appreciate it. And we'll see everybody at 1:00 again. All right.
Yeah, thank you, Niall. Thank you. I feel honored. Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for the lovely comments.